So we are now moving on to our discussant's comment, and it'll be from Bill Balée. Bill?
Hi, thank you, Junko. I very much appreciate those two excellent presentations. Congratulations to both of you, Ikeya-san and Professor Gary Crawford. I see some interesting tie-ins between these two talks. They're in the sense of looking in particular at how previous categorizations of hunting and gathering vis-a-vis agriculture really don't apply very well when we're looking at contexts that either haven't been documented sufficiently historically or simply don't exist anymore. And I think, you know, use of millet could very well be something like that, could have been a much more important crop in the past. Kind of the way a crop like sugar used to be rare in Europe and was and came from Asia, it was very valuable among the other spices. And now today, you know, generally speaking, it's a kind of poorer people's food. And there are some of these things that are the opposite. We've had spices that were once incredibly valuable, but they couldn't be found in the New World. And then in the New World, certain kinds of alternatives were found that are the same thing. For example, there's a New World version of cinnamon. There's also New World connections to the lacquer tree, even though they didn't use a tree, although there are relatives here. It's in the Anacardiaceae family, which is poison ivy family or poison sumac, which is what lacquer tree is related to most closely, sumac, and that word is related etymologically. But on the millet, in particular, if you go to Ikeya-san's slide that says item C, showing people, I think it was in maybe Kyushu, sowing millet. He used the word sowing, S-O-W-I-N-G. That means tossing something out, like very small seeds. And of course, as Gary points out, these millets basically are just very small seeded grasses that, you know, some are edible, some aren't, and or small grains rather, small grains, but they tend to be, a lot of them, you know, are in the grass family. So, you know, from an Amazonian perspective, that's the area where I do field work in the Amazon region of South America. There's an indigenous group I've worked with for many years, the Ka'apor people, who have a word for that same kind of planting, throwing or sowing things around. And they would use that for a very tiny seeded thing, like the tobacco plant, which is a Native American domesticate, Nicotiana tabacum. That they say they throw, umboriha. That's different from actually digging a hole in the dirt and planting something like a tree or a manioc plant, or, you know, in the case of Japan, you know, it could be the Japanese taro or something else that has to be inserted into the ground. And I'm saying this because there are different ways of looking at just how far along is something domesticated based on the level of the management that goes into it. So it strikes me as, you know, they have two different words for planting. So one is mboriha, just throwing something out, and the other is yitim, which is digging a hole and putting something into it, something more intensive, seems more intentional. But this Eastern Amazon region is famous for a very rich fruit related to cacao. It's called cupuaçu, and it's found in the forest. But in a sense, the forest is partly the result of people having manipulated it over time. So you talk about landscape modification in Hakodate or in Maruyama in Toku. You certainly have that going on in other places. And some archaeologists are calling these invisible landscapes because you didn't see just how much impact people would have in the past. And one of the things involved that you mentioned in a very interesting article that I read of yours, Professor Crawford, in the book edited by Junko on East Asian archaeology, is the peach tree. So is a fruit, been selected for a juicy fruit. Well, in the Amazon, you find this too. The fruit trees that are the juiciest, in many cases, have been domesticated. We have, there's some genomic evidence for that. In the case of this plant closely related to Kupuasu, people will say, I will say, how did that get there? And they will say, well, monkeys threw it there. And yet at the same time, well, monkeys come to people's villages after they've been abandoned, and they find those trees there because a person could have thrown the seed out of his mouth after sucking away the juicy pulp. And if the tree grows, then they tend to not cut it down. They leave it in the village because it will be something they could, harvest around the fruiting season. It's maybe not exactly domestication, but it certainly is some kind of management. And I think you're talking about that when you're looking at the different seed sizes of the starch amount in the millets that you were looking, or rather just simply the seed size differences of the Japanese millet at around 4,000 years ago in Hokkaido, which leads me to another question. I mean, both these papers shows they sort of turn traditional received wisdom upside down because the traditional literature, at least what I've read, and I honestly don't read Japanese, I've only read it in English, but it gives you the sense that agriculture comes into Japan from China via Korea to Kyushu, and then, from Kansai to Kanto. But you have way up there in Hokkaido in the Jomon period, I don't know, plant management, maybe even domestication going on because the lacquer tree, Rus toxidodendron, certainly was managed, and it seems to have grown around paddy rice fields on ridges. And Juko can confirm this because she's worked with this tree in Iwate Prefecture, right, Juko? Yeah.
Yes, I have a slide later.
Of the Joboji area,
yes.
Right? And I have a slide of that too. It's a beautiful place where they're actually planting lacquer trees. And I wonder, in traditional times, say Edo times, when lacquer was so valuable, and people even lacquered their castles. Some daimyo lacquered their castles. You can imagine the amount of work that went into that and how valuable that was. That maybe it was more managed than really domesticated. It was already there in the landscape, but was being used and distributed more by people or dispersed more, but not necessarily with a major change in its genotype. Due to this interesting concept of what you call domestication syndrome in your chapter in that book. The other thing I think is very interesting here is if you look at the crops that people were looking at and beginning to domesticate, say around in the Hokkaido or Hakodate area in Jomon times and then into Satsumon times. I thought it was quite fascinating that you would compare Satsumon period with Chinese Neolithic because, people have often classified the Ainu as hunter-gatherers. And this is always, of course, the paradox. These are hunter-gatherers who actually have some agriculture going on, as on the Northwest coast. So, whereas maybe that wasn't the most important food item, but it was certainly in the landscape and something that they used for the purpose or involved in the purpose of landscape modification that they did, which is what we look at in historical ecology. And there are two kinds: primary landscape transformation, which involves a major overhaul of species or turnover of species, and a secondary landscape transformation, which is a partial impact in that area. And that is what I would say that that is how I would view Ikeya-san's paper on slash and burn in Japan, which ironically seems after World War II, it's obviously coming after agricultural intensification, paddy rice, irrigation, and so on. All that is intensive primary landscape transformation. You have to change the substrate to have paddy rice, but you don't necessarily have to do that for slash and burn. One last point I was going to if I have any, I think a couple minutes left. Is that correct, Jennifer? Yeah.
Yes.
I did have a couple of questions, but I'll ask those at the end. If you look at this sowing idea, you know, if you go to Balée, everybody likes to talk about how the island is completely domesticated, and I've seen it. You're riding from the top of the volcano down to the bottom. There's paddy rice in all directions, but every now and then, people are also using other products, and a lot of it has to do with bamboo growing along the edges of these rice fields. And I doubt if that bamboo is simply there, you know, accidentally, because it is so useful. And either it's managed or it's domesticated. And I was wondering about the bamboo forest that was being managed in one of the slides that IKEA showed. And I know that the seeds are very tiny. And it occurs to me, you know, bamboo is something that's cyclical. Depending on the species, and it's a grass, by the way. Bamboo is a grass in the grass family, Poaceae, just as the millet are in that family, Japanese millet and so on. It's a huge family of plants. But I'm wondering if, you know, every 20 years or so, they will flower and many will, you know, die off and then come back, perhaps rhizomatically. But I was curious if there's any direct management of the bamboo itself. And moreover, how could you show that? Do people sow it as you say they did with the millet or not? And that may be a naive question. I don't know. I'm just curious. And the last thing I would just say is, I was curious if there was no real need to modify soils that much, apart from the paddy rice, in terms of these agricultural processes that both of you were discussing. So I think I'll leave it at that. Much enjoyed both papers, and congratulations again. Thank you, Junko.
Thank you very much, Bill. These are all very important points. We are running out of time, so we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we're going to keep what you raised into the discussion. And also, I'd like to thank 2 people who gave us comments, Binaya's comment in the Q&A section, and Furusawa-san's additional information about recent developments in the slash and burn agriculture studies. So when you have the chance, take a look at them. And we'll resume right at 6:10 p.m. in 5 minutes.